Hi, students. This is a website and an organization called the Edward O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation, and we're specifically looking at their Half-Earth Map project. I'm a big fan of this tool. I'm a big fan of maps in general. I think maps are an awesome way of learning a tremendous amount and intuiting about a particular area. There is a strong connection between the geography of a location and the diversity that we see in that particular region. And what's wonderful about this project and this particular tool is it's an interactive map, which means it allows us to see a tremendous amount of things that we can then use to come to certain conclusions about a particular region, particularly with regards to its diversity, its biodiversity. There is an estimated 2 million species that have been recorded by scientists, but experts estimate that there are about 10 million species on Earth. So we have not even begun, we're not even 20% of the way through, if these estimates are right, to accurately categorizing all of the diversity on Earth. And I think that this program and this tool is actually a very helpful way of figuring out, well, if we haven't captured all of the diversity on the planet, where is that likely to be? We can, looking at maps, by looking at areas that are very diverse, we can interpret where are the places that we need to protect so that we can eventually, over time, find those particular species that have yet to be discovered. So we're going to go to this website, halfearthproject.org, and we're going to go to Explore Maps. Now, there is a lot here. We are going to take a brief tour, and I want you to think of this tool kind of like a sandbox where you can create things that you find interesting by exploring all of the available data. So the map compiles data from lots of different databases. Among the places that they use are data from the United Nations and from other organizations that specialize in looking at the total biodiversity of the globe. And we can see here areas that are hotspots of biodiversity. So we're going to zero in on a particular area. For this example, we're going to use one that we already know has a large amount of biodiversity. We're going to take a look at Brazil. So as we can see, Brazil, according to current estimates, and the map is updated very regularly, 29% of the total land mass of the political boundaries of Brazil is protected, and there are 4,048 vertebrate species. Right. So as we look at Brazil, we can intuit a couple of interesting things with the map right away. The denser green areas would be the areas that have the largest amount of biodiversity. And without even looking at a traditional political map, we can fairly reasonably guess what is here. It's pretty accurate to say that this is the area of the Brazil that is the rainforest. And let's take a look at the country as a whole. So we're looking at the human impact. So 49% of the land mass of Brazil is facing human pressure. We can take a look and see what areas are facing the most pressure and which areas are facing less pressure, and the different kinds of pressures that we can that the area is facing. So let's take a look at urban pressure. Let's see, where are the cities? Where are the areas where there are a lot of individuals? So we can see that the urban pressure is on the coastlines, which makes sense for most of human history. Pressure, it might be easier to see that, yeah. So when we remove the protected areas, we can see that there is a tremendous amount of pressure along the coastlines, which makes sense because humans, we need food and water, and coastlines are an easy place to get access to water. Now, when we look at the patterns here, we see that the coastline faces a great amount of urban pressure. And what's also interesting is we have this urban pressure here. Now, that we can also intuit is along the Amazon River, which makes sense since there's water, which means that there's food and or access to food and access to trade and access to movement, relatively easy movement. It is easier to ship or move things along water than it is to ship it by land. So it would make sense that for all of human civilization, people have congregated around bodies of water, particularly moving the water. So urban pressure is just one type of pressure that is faced. Let's take a look at agriculture. Interesting. So we see that agriculture is predominantly more southern bound in Brazil. We can think of the combined challenge of agriculture of irrigated and rain-fed. So rain-fed being sort of what the natural capacity of agriculture would be for the country, and irrigated would be us extending that capacity. We can see that a large portion of the southern part of Brazil is devoted to making and generating food. Now, rangeland adds an interesting additional challenge, because rangeland meaning this is where beef, pork, and other meats are, predominantly beef, although I guess goats and sheep would also be part of that, are capable of being supported. So as we can see, the vast majority, approximately 60% of Brazil, is being used for feeding people. Far more land is required to produce the food that it takes to feed us than it takes to actually keep us in terms of shelter. So when we think that of the 8 million kilometers of Brazil, we're talking about 60%. So let's say 5 million kilometers or so are required to sustain human beings. And the 30% of the country that is protected, predominantly in the rainforest, has lower population density than the rest. Now, I'd like to take a look at the species that we can see here in Brazil. So we look at all of the terrestrial vertebrates, meaning all of the land-based vertebrates. So we can see birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians. So there's some things that we can intuit from this. One thing that I think is very interesting is birds. So no creature is recognizing these political boundaries that is called Brazil. So the creatures that are least likely to be threatened, relatively speaking, are the creatures that are able to be the most mobile. If there's a problem in this area, then they might be able to move to another area. So we can see, when we're looking at birds, that there is a less, relatively speaking, a lower level of potential threat. Here we go. Okay. So when we look at the long-tailed cinclodes, that sounds about right. We can take a look at the range. This bird is able to go 5,000 kilometers is able to travel a tremendous amount, which means that it is relatively less vulnerable to particular challenges than, let's say, a creature that has a lower level of range. So, for example, let's take a look at there's a couple of ones that I wanted to find that are really have a much smaller overall habitat. So if it looks like I'm trying to figure this out, it's because there's so much here to explore that there's things that I just simply have not seen yet. So there's some things, again, we can intuit when we look at something like alligators. We would think that their overall range, that their ability to operate is fairly wide given their ability to maneuver. I would want to look at this idea of the portion of their range is under protection. This idea of under protection is an important concept. So we will find the greatest amount of potential biodiversity in the spots of the earth that humans are least operating in. So to the extent that we can leave areas alone, then it allows nature to thrive within those areas. So part of the reason why preserving the Amazon rainforest is so important is because we want to minimize our overall interaction there. There's several reasons that we want to maintain this sort of biodiversity. One of the main reasons is, of course, there's a tremendous amount of interactions in terms of species. So if one species declines, then it might mean another species, let's say prey, would increase or possibly decrease depending upon the nature of the interaction. On a somewhat cynical or practical level, there's the reality that every species being unique, there's potentials for discovery for, future medicines might just be developed from a species that we have yet to discover. But I think ultimately, most importantly, is the fact that there's a tremendous amount of beauty and in the world created through diversity. Let's take a quick look at this particular species. So this gives us an idea of the particular range. This is what I love about this program, is how it gives you an idea of the individual species, its range. So you can see, for example, this crocodile has a tremendous amount of range, which is related to its overall protected status, or I should say its threatened status. So because it has a large range, it is fairly
Thank you.
safe, relatively speaking. Whereas if we find
I think they're pretty much done. The accelerated jump. The honors my name. Yeah.
creature with like this South American snake-headed turtle, we can intuit that given that its range is smaller, that it is likely, even if it's undefined, it is much likely to be more threatened than something that has a large range. So there's a tremendous amount of